Not much of the world's international diplomacy takes place before our eyes. Only a fraction of it is visible to the press and public, the tip of the iceberg. What we don't see below the surface is the shadowy world of secret alliances, of plots and threats, tactics and deals, deceit and pressure, politics, and international terrorism. The world of international diplomacy is something that goes on under our noses in the world's major cities across every country, minute by minute, every single day. Diplomats travel with special passports that provide them with immunity. They're not subject to the jurisdiction of the host country's courts. They operate and move between the world's embassies, consulates, missions, and commissions, which are always suspected to be a hotbed of espionage activity, full of secrets and sensitive information. It's common knowledge that spies and diplomats have used special high-priority sealed pouches that are exempt from export and import duties, as well as postal, law enforcement, airline, and customs scrutiny. While these diplomatic pouches were supposed to contain letters, memos, reports, and documents relating to diplomatic business, there's no end of items they're likely to have contained at some point in time. Firearms, drugs, rare and valuable artifacts, and national defense and spy material are all well known to have been transported in diplomatic pouches. Even dead bodies have been suspected. As technology caught up, HF radio systems were put in place in many of the world's diplomatic properties, places considered the sovereign territory of the countries that occupy them. It very quickly became easier than ever to send and receive documents and any manner of information without the risk of a diplomat or spy leaving the building and using diplomatic pouches. London is widely believed to be the espionage capital of the world. Stories have broken over the years that give the impression that it's a den of spies from all manner of places. It has a rich history of espionage, and one of my favourite spots is Embassy Row. Situated on Kensington Palace Gardens, this tree-lined street boasts beautiful mansions set back behind iron gates. These mansions are embassies, consulates, high commissions, and ambassador residences for some of the world's biggest nations. Russia has a property here, and so does France. There are armed police at either end, and you cannot take photographs. I always take a walk down here whenever I'm in London, and have seen on numerous occasions people come out of the properties to shout at anybody taking photos. The information in this video is fairly obscure, and I'm sure by now you know it relates to these sorts of properties. In London today, to my knowledge, only the Bulgarian Embassy and Pakistan High Commission are home to impressive antenna arrays used for diplomatic communications. I took these photos hastily last year that show their huge log periodic antennas on the rooftops. Embassy Row is always a no-go for me in terms of photography. In another trip last year, as I passed the official residence of the Russian ambassador in Kensington Palace Gardens, I noticed 3 men on the roof erecting a new antenna. Many antennas have been removed from London's embassies now, and there's a lot of sites, and I've checked most of them. Due to the lack of newer photos, I'll show you lots of historic photos of the golden age of London's rich diplomatic communications networks. In other countries though, as you'll see, there's still an abundance of antennas. The rollout of these systems, not long after World War II, naturally raised a lot of questions. If a transmitter is going into an embassy, whose rules does it follow? Does it follow its host country rules or its own? What call sign does it use? What power output? And what frequencies? What about harmonics, transmitter stability and interference? Why would any country allow another to set up a private communications network to send and receive signals from home, especially when it may be a Soviet setup in the United States and vice versa? Who decides where the line is drawn on what information is actually sent and received? How would it be enforced, especially given that embassies and consulates are pretty much known to have been used for espionage activities at some point or another? Could a country try to stop another from putting a communication system in a diplomatic property? And what would be the consequences of them putting it in anyway? None of this really mattered. Think about it. If your enemy is sending and receiving sensitive information under your nose, then there's nothing to stop you from intercepting it. Yes, it may be encrypted or encoded, but at least you can monitor the frequency of traffic and compare it to world events. It turns out that encryption wasn't all it cracked up to be either, with Libya being one country whose diplomatic communications were intercepted by the US on multiple occasions. By the 1950s, several countries began to establish diplomatic communications networks. They operated for some time on an unofficial and somewhat clandestine basis. Their host countries turned a blind eye so as not to cause a threat to their own networks. An international radio conference in Vienna eventually fully recognized diplomatic communications networks as legal and above board. In the years that followed, the news media regularly carried stories of Soviet embassies in the United States throwing up huge birdcage dipoles, loops, and long wires on their rooftops. The US government didn't appear too concerned. Accepting it and manipulating it to their own end was much easier than kicking up a fuss that might well reveal and then cause them to have to explain their own participation in these systems. It doesn't take an expert to work out that this secret world of communications wasn't just used to send invites to embassy tea parties. Data sent via coded messages over SSB, Morse code, RTTY and ARQ, as well as proprietary experimental modes, could hide all manner of information. The subject: messages of a diplomatic nature. That sounds awfully vague, doesn't it? It's believed that these messages range from anything from passport information, news and reports, information on head of state visits, and anything mundane, to messages to terrorists and espionage agents in the field. The Reagan administration intercepted Libyan diplomatic messages that implicated the Libyan government in a rash of terrorist bombings against Americans and American property in Europe. Many countries assigned distinctive call signs to their stations and used their own prefixes regardless of those assigned to their host nation. The United Nations used 4U, and the Red Cross used 88, radio shorthand for love and kisses. Whether this was intentional isn't clear. Foreign diplomatic stations within the United States were first required to use a block of call signs from KNY20 to KNY40. They were authorized to use 1 kilowatt output power, although evidence suggests that many used much higher power levels. They weren't regulated by the FCC either, but rather the Department of State. The United States diplomatic stations were also governed by the Department of State. Some sources claimed they were under control of the Department of State Intelligence Service, and others claimed Central Intelligence Agency governance. This led to the theory that US diplomatic stations were directly involved in intelligence and espionage. When a query was raised with the FCC, they refused to answer who was operating the stations, which further supported the notion that they were bigger than the FCC and had to be operated by the CIA. Later on, the term backchannels began floating around, which referred to, quote, the secret and secure communications network maintained by the CIA at all embassies. This was a set of frequencies that bypassed State Department frequencies and were switched into play when traffic of a clandestine nature needed to be sent covertly and directly to the target or object. A big challenge was hiding the content of the transmissions being sent. One way was to use a little spoken language, or to convert the messages to groups of numbers. In World War II, the US Army used Navajo to send messages. The enemy couldn't understand Navajo, and so it proved successful. Libya initially sent their messages in the Berber language, but by 1986, US government monitors could speak and understand Berber. Groups of numbers could be either generated and decoded by computers or using one-time pads. Both methods have proven successful because, to this day, no coded number message using this method has ever been deciphered. One-time pads were meant for deciphering messages by hand in the field, whereas at embassies and other government properties, computer systems could do the job much quicker. I intend to cover one-time pads in another installment, but in simple terms, they're a system in which a randomly generated private key is used only once to encrypt a message that is then decrypted by the receiver using a matching one-time pad and key. If the key is truly random and never reused, a one-time pad cannot be cracked by any known method. You may be thinking we're straying into number stations here, but there's a reason for this. In 1983, a shortwave listener sent a reception report to La Voz de Nicaragua. To his surprise, they replied and included a small booklet called CIA Conspiracy. It told of how 4-digit Spanish numbers were being sent from Warrenton Training Center in Virginia, and that Marlene Moncada, who signed up to be a CIA agent whilst in Honduras working at the Nicaraguan embassy, was using them. It claimed she used one-time pads made of chewing gum to decipher the number strings. There's no way of knowing if this was a propaganda attempt, but it was later revealed that 4-digit Spanish numbers did emanate from Warrenton Training Center, which was also used for embassy communications. This really confirmed a close tie between diplomatic and espionage communications. Of course, these allegations have always been hotly denied by every nation of the world. Diplomatic communications have been a subject of rumour and conspiracy. Theories spread like wildfire that suggested the source of the transmissions were drug smugglers, terrorists, banks, and spies. I said earlier that rather than resist the threat of diplomatic communications networks in your country, you could always use them to your advantage. Even if messages can't be decrypted, they're monitored and recorded because the number of messages sent, the formats used, and the intelligence on the location they're being sent to are all highly valuable snippets of information. Places such as Menwith Hill, a highly secret electronic spy base that provides intelligence and communication support to the UK and US, was believed to be recording and monitoring espionage and diplomatic communications, and likely still does. Who's to say that what couldn't be decoded then hasn't been decoded since, and what can't be decoded now won't be decoded in the future? GCHQ in Cheltenham is also believed to have always monitored espionage and diplomatic communications, and it's obvious that every major intelligence centre in nations far and wide does the same. Some transmissions have been decoded successfully. A complex Libyan system being used to send a message from Tripoli to the Libyan People Bureau in London was cracked. The problem there was that it took too long to decipher, with disastrous results. The message sent in April 1984 instructed embassy staff to fire on demonstrators gathering in the street outside the embassy. By the time the message was deciphered and the police were informed, it was too late, and one officer was killed. From not long after the advent of HF diplomatic communications networks, other technologies rivaled and in many cases eclipsed shortwave. Commercial wireline and cable systems, as well as satellites, began to run alongside them. Today, secure phone lines, computers, encryption, and satellites have replaced much of the world's HF diplomatic communications networks. There are still many HF antennas on the roofs of the world's embassies and consulates. To what extent they're used nowadays is as much of a mystery as the traffic they sent. The focus of stories today is Russia. There has been an increase in radio antennas and equipment on rooftops of Russian consulates and embassies in many countries, as you've seen in some of the photos I've already shown you. Moldova, Sweden, Slovakia, Croatia, Poland, the list goes on. Do you think there's a relation between espionage and diplomatic communications? I think it's already been clear to see for decades. Get in touch and let me know if you have any stories or photos of embassy rooftops.